His innocence is undoubted. That's from the family of a retired U.S. Marine who's been detained in Russia, rejecting Russia's accusation that he's a spy. The American citizen is 48-year-old Paul Whelan, a former Marine, as we said, from Michigan. Russia's security agency released a brief statement saying that Whelan was arrested on December 28th, caught, quote, during an espionage operation, but did not provide any specifics of the charges involved. Whelan could face a prison sentence of up to 20 years. His family says Paul was visiting Moscow to attend a wedding when they noticed he was no longer in communication. The State Department is pushing for consular access. The department says the Russian Foreign Ministry provided formal notification of the arrest Monday, and his family has expressed deep concerns for his safety and well-being. Joining me on the phone is Paul Whelan's twin brother, David. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing? How's your family?
I think we're doing the best we can in light of very little information and a rather implausible situation.
So what do you know? First, let's just talk about the basics. Why was he in Russia? How did you realize something was wrong?
Paul was in Russia to help a friend out who was having a wedding in Moscow. And so he arrived and had been a part of the wedding party for a day or two prior to the 28th. And had even in that morning, the 28th, helped out on a tour around the Kremlin. His friend had asked him to help because Paul had been to Russia before. He has traveled widely, and his work takes him around the globe. And so it was a surprise when that evening there were no more communications from Paul, neither back to the States, where he would have been worried about his dog and his family, or from people with the wedding, and he didn't show up at the wedding. And so that caused us some alarm. And it wasn't really until Monday morning that we understood that he had been detained by the Russian government.
Was it the State Department? How did you find out, and are you in touch with someone? Has someone been assigned to you by the U.S. government to keep you informed on what they know and what they're doing?
We learned about Paul's detention from online newswires that had republished the Russian ministry's announcement about his detention. We have been speaking to people at the State Department since then, and we've had some very strong help from the people at the embassy in Moscow, although I'm not really clear on the 72-hour limit, but there's a window that has to close before they are able to get consular access to Paul. So no one, as far as I know, has seen or spoken to him yet.
Yeah, I guess the question is, it's just, I mean, so bizarre. I think of the last numbers I saw, tourism, U.S. tourism to Russia was up. There's so many people, thousands who go there every year. Had your brother been there before? And is what's going through your mind, why him?
Yeah, he's been to Russia at least since 2007, because I've seen a picture of him in front of the Kremlin back then when he was on R&R from he was a Marine serving in Iraq, and he was on R&R, and he decided to take the opportunity to go to Russia and be a tourist. So he did, and he loves to travel. So I wasn't at all surprised that he would be confident going to Russia. He has a law enforcement background. He's got his Marine background. He does corporate security, and he's aware of the risks of traveling in certain parts of the world. So it would just never have occurred to me that A, he would have any sort of trouble in a large metropolitan area, or B, that his background would suggest that he would be willing to commit any crime, let alone an espionage crime.
So there's absolutely no doubt in your mind that these charges against him are trumped up?
No doubt.
You tweeted this: my brother was detained by the Russian government on Friday as an alleged spy. While the law library plus InfoFocus will remain, you may see an increase in off-message topics until we get him safely home. What is that about?
I'm a professional law librarian, and I tend to stick very much inside my lane and talk about law libraries and information and how to use it. And so I just wanted to let people know who follow me that they may occasionally see something that's a little bit more personal than I normally would share on social media.
And understandably so. Do you have a sense of what you and your family can do? I mean, I can't even imagine being thrust into a situation like this.
I think it's really difficult. It's trite to say that you can use the web and you can use Google, but there's actually a good deal of information on the U.S. government sites to help you get a sense of what you might need to deal with. But the reality is there's no way for us to assess the quality or competency of Russian counsel, and so we will go along with the embassy's recommended list, and hopefully Paul will find a lawyer that will be able to help him through the criminal allegations that Russia has alleged, and that we will continue to work with the Congress, with Michigan senators, Michigan representatives, and any other part of the government who can help us to bring Paul home.
I guess just finally, and everybody would understand that statement you guys put out about how concerned you are for his safety. Anybody would be in your situation. Having said that, does it give you a little bit of comfort knowing what his background is, both in the military, the extensive travel that he's done, that he, I don't want to say would know how to navigate this situation, but would be more knowledgeable than some other people who might find themselves in what would absolutely be a terrifying situation?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, you can't plan for arbitrary, but for a set of skills to have to try and deal with this kind of a situation, I think Paul has a superior set of skills to most of us, certainly to what I would have had if I was in his situation. And so hopefully he won't have to deploy too many of those skills in order to survive and to come home. Well,
I can imagine that everyone watching this, David, is rooting for Paul, obviously, for your whole family, thinking about you, and we hope there's a good resolution to this, and very, very quickly. We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.